Okay, good morning. My name is Sam. Originally, I'm West African. I grew up in Ghana. I spent about 14 years in Stockholm studying and working. I moved here about 15 months ago, so I wouldn't have known my way here if Rhea hadn't brought me. I'm still trying to figure out how this place works. I've been asked to talk to you about academic reading. It was one of those things when we studied, nobody really taught us. And towards the end of my PhD, when I finally got a hang of it, I was like, why on earth couldn't you be taught? It would have shaved off at least a year off my PhD. So you can safely consider yourself among the lucky ones in the sense that there is formal instruction on the subject, because otherwise it makes the process of doing research and writing your dissertation extremely painful. So we're going to try to make this work. Now, how many people here have written dissertations or term papers before? Okay. And I ask this question because I took a bachelor's degree in economics and we never had to write a term paper or a dissertation. We simply wrote exams all the way to the final degree. That tells you something about the differences in educational quality around the world. Now, for those of you who've written it, were you given reading lists or did you have to make up your own? How many people were given a list of readings to use, and how many people had to find their own reading? How many people had to make up their own reading? How many people were given a list of materials to use? Okay. So if you had to find your own reading, what tools and services did you use to search for your material? Google Scholar. Oh, this is a more advanced class than I thought. Okay, good. Very good. And how many people use Wikipedia? Okay.
I want them. No Wikipedia.
Oh. We can ask her to leave the room so we can have some honest chats. Okay. How do you keep records of your writing? Of the materials you use in writing, how do you keep records? How many people simply highlight what they read and stash them away? Okay. How many people make notes on separate pieces of paper and bind them together? How many people simply read and write notes in the margins? Okay, for those of you who highlight, I have good news for you. There's research that shows that highlighting is actually the least effective form of reading. How about that? May we have your highlighters, please? Okay. All right. Is there anybody here who apparently in trying to write, you realize, oh, I've read this somewhere. I simply don't remember where I've read it. And, you know, because I can't find it, I'm not going to be able to use it because Ray is going to be after my butt for plagiarism. How many people has that happened to? Okay. Welcome to the human race then. It happened to the rest of us. So, did you manage to track it down eventually? Sometimes. And how long does it take to track it down? Forever. Okay. All right. I'm just trying to make sure if I have something useful to say today. Okay. I'm just establishing the baseline. So let's just skip this now. So let's go quickly to the point. I have an idea what's going on here. So let's talk about, before we go into the actual how to read, I'm just going to go over some additional ground issues here. Now, I suspect at some point you will all write a research report, right? And that research report will be based on some research proposal. Yes? Okay. And you probably would need to do some kind of literature review to figure out what topic you want to work on, what research questions you want to answer. Now, it turns out it works in that sequence, that the quality of what you eventually do feeds into the quality of the next item on the agenda and your eventual research report. So it means that basically if you screw up this part, you're very likely to screw up this part. Okay? That's the way it works. But if you get this right, it kind of feeds into the quality of what eventually comes out. Right? So, being able to find quality literature, being able to synthesize and use it to arrive at good research topics and execute a good research report is what we're trying to do. And if you do this right, then you're laying a solid foundation for doing good research. And I can tell you this. When I started my PhD, I was made to do a literature review. Now, part of the reason you won't find a literature review anywhere on the web, where however hard you try, because I've carefully hidden it, is that it was bad. Because that was at the time, I didn't know any of this. I didn't know any of this. And very often what occurs in the university system is that it's taken for granted. You should know this. If you're at the master's level, you're a mature student, you should know this. Except that unless you're formally taught, these things don't lend themselves to easy learning. Now, to be able to do this, you need to search for information, critically analyze your sources, read and take notes, develop an outline draft, and then from there you're able to find a topic and a set of research questions. Now, people have discovered that increasingly academics in their own area, academics in their own area cannot understand what their colleagues have written. All right, experienced academics in some areas struggle to understand what their colleagues have written because it's written in such dense language. So imagine you're not an expert in the subject. It's even harder, right? It's even harder, which is the reason we need to teach this in explicit ways. So once you do this, it's very much an easy, relatively easy matter to go into formulating a research proposal where you basically take this and expand it into a proposal. And then when you go and collect data and analyze the data, you can easily extend that into a report. So this is almost like the production chain of what you're going to be doing. Now, today's reading is about some of the things that will happen around here. Because when you have to formulate research problems for RIA, she's going to ask you, you need to substantiate your research problem. And you need to validate your research questions, both from practice but also from the body of knowledge. Now, if you haven't surveyed the body of knowledge, you don't know what's there, you can't substantiate what you want to do. Now, if you had to put together a literature review, most review papers typically take this form. Right? You have an introductory part where they basically just give you an idea what the thing is going to be about. The main body of the thing is a survey of the literature, and then they discuss and conclude and write the references. So I tend to use this when I start a research project, which is I try to write a literature review on the subject. Because that is my way of trying to own the body of knowledge before I start working on the part that I'm interested in. So let's quickly run through these issues before we go into reading. Now, supposing a group of friends are in a building having a conversation, and someone walks in the middle of the conversation and starts talking. Almost invariably, you turn around and say, hey, you didn't even know what we're talking about. What are you talking about? Because he wasn't there when the discussion started, right? So typically, we all accept that to say something meaningful in a conversation, you ought to have been there from the start and know what everybody else was talking about. There's a similar process here, that you're not able to say anything coherent or smart about a research area you're interested in unless you know what others have been discussing on the topic. Okay? It's the same process here. So to do good research, you need to start off by creating your own sense of what is known and what is unknown about a topic, which is the reason you need to survey the literature. Now, it turns out that in addition to that, the literature therefore becomes the source of the topics that you're going to need for your research, theories that may be appropriate for the kind of topic you want to discuss. And most people struggle to find which methodologies they need to use when they do their research. And the literature is also the first hint as to what methods might be appropriate. So the literature is fundamentally important if you want to do good research. Now, there is, should I call it a pecking order? There's a pecking order as far as the kind of literature you might use is concerned. Now, at the top of the pecking order, you would have scientific journals that are peer-reviewed. And at the bottom, you have internet sources and a series of other things in between. Now, this is not everybody will rank it like this. Some people might rank it a little differently. But there is consensus that at the top of it, you tend to have articles, journal articles with peer review. Why is that? Anybody knows? Sorry? It's recent information. Yeah, that's partly true. Even though some journals, in order to get your paper published, you would have submitted it 3 years earlier. So by the time it comes out, it's already 3 years old. But it's relatively recent. But yes.
I think the scientific proof that this in peer reviewed as there's evidence that this is giving value to the, it's giving new value.
Right. They would typically subject it to a very, sometimes painful process of having your peers who are experts in the area they want them to scrutinize it. And sometimes the scrutiny, as I said, can take about 2 years, 3 years. Right? Okay. And then they will send you a series of harsh comments and ask you to redo the thing. Or sometimes they'll tell you outright, no, this is not good, we're not going to publish it. Or if the editor is polite, you say, well, this falls outside the scope of what we publish, so maybe you should send it to somebody else. Just because it doesn't want to tell you, well, see, this paper is nonsense. But the thing about the peer review process is that it allows a situation where what eventually comes out satisfies some minimum quality standards in terms of validity, reliability, and also contribution to knowledge and conformity to the scientific method. So that's one of the reasons. Now, why did I put dissertations somewhere in the middle? Dissertations can be a good source of information as to what we know about a subject. But you see, as I told you earlier, there are universities that teach people how to do research, and there are universities that don't teach people how to do research. And even among the universities that teach people how to do research, there are those who just talk about it, and then there are those who actually teach it. You know how you cannot get a man to play cricket by giving him a lecture on cricket? Or you know how you cannot get a man to ride a bicycle by giving him a lecture about cycling? You know that. I mean, supposing I put you here and say, you know, here's how you bike. Okay, now here's a bike, go bike. You know you can't do it. Now it's the same thing. In some universities, they teach research simply by lecturing about it. In some universities, they teach you by actually getting you to do stuff, right? As a result of that, the dissertations that may come out of this process will be of varying quality. So yes, if it's a university where research is actually being taught hands-on like you're doing here, then there is a likelihood that those who are coming after you next year can refer to what you've done, because there's some quality to it. But if on the other hand, all you've had is a series of lectures and you read some nice fancy book and no one did any hands-on exercises, then there's a likelihood that what may come out may not be of good quality, which means that using it to establish the body of knowledge is a dodgy process, which is the reason dissertations are somewhere in the middle. Now, why am I putting internet sources at the bottom? Well, internet sources would include, for example, Wikipedia. And I think the Wikipedia argument has been well articulated here, so I don't have to go into that. But there are several other internet sources. Some of them don't even have names of the authors. And some might even belong to organizations that are not in the business of articulating objective knowledge, but only articulating certain opinions disguised as facts. Or they may just be people spewing total garbage simply because they have access to a computer and internet. Now, you can go online and search. These days is the most efficient way of searching. Very few people, how many people go to the TUT library? How many people don't know what TUT library is?
Building 20.
Now you know. How many people are not registered with the TUT library? Okay. I would strongly encourage you to do that ASAP, because a lot of what you need to be able to access at least online. Now, to locate information, you need to know how to search strategically. There are two general approaches. You can just go out and browse, manually examine what is there. But since a number of you don't know where the library is, you can't even do that. On the other hand, you can do keyword searching. I know where the VITS library is, but I've only been there twice to do non-library related business. But I do use the VITS library quite often. Typically, we tend to prefer you use Google Scholar rather than general Google. Why? Because Google Scholar, you know the difference between Google and Google Scholar? Yeah, Google Scholar is the Google for nerds. Yes? For us. Not for the general public. That's, if you're nerdy, you go to Google Scholar. If you're not nerdy, you go to normal Google. So when we want to do nerdy stuff like write research, then we go to Google Scholar, because that's where you find a big repository of academic material. Now, as I said, if you want to say anything intelligent about a particular area of research, you need to know what the latest discussion on the subject is. So if you're searching for literature, it makes sense to start with the most recent. Now, I had a student in my class who presented a research proposal, and his research problem he justified with an article from '95. And I said, that was a long time ago. A lot must have happened on this topic since then. There is no guarantee what you're telling me now is probably still a problem. Because, I mean, 95, how old were you? And he was laughing. So I said, look, you're grown up now. You want to tell me nothing has happened on this subject since 95? Of course not. A lot has happened. So you always need to start with the most recent years. Do we have access to internet here?
No, unfortunately not.
Unfortunately not. Okay. Otherwise, I'd have done a little demo. But if you go to Google Scholar, you look on your left-hand side, it gives you the option to set the years in which you want to search for the material. Start with 2013. Because we're already in the first quarter, right? Okay. Now, here's the strategy I use to search for my information. You probably may be given areas in which you should do your research, or you may be left free to go and choose the area in which you want to do your research. So it pays to start with a research area, and I have created a truncated version of these steps. What I typically do now is that if I'm interested in an area, I try to find someone who's written a literature review on the area. Okay, so you start with an area, try and locate the best literature review you can find on the area. Find a review paper on the area. The advantage with a review paper is that someone has done the job of trying to summarize what we know about a subject for you. So it's like getting to read an introductory book on a subject. Now, inside a review paper, you will find the key definitions you're probably going to be grappling with, the key concepts you're going to be dealing with. You might even get a summary of some of the methodologies being used in the area. And if you go into the references, you might find tons of some of the most interesting papers written on the subject, right? So from there, you will be able to get some definitions and keywords and concepts in the area you're interested in. You can now then take these key words and key concepts and go into Google Scholar and start searching. Because without that, you don't even know where to start from, right? So start with a good review paper on the subject, read it, identify the key concepts. So you can do that this weekend. Look for the best review paper in the area you're interested in, read it, try and use that reading to generate some key concepts, go back into Google Scholar and start searching. Now, typically what will happen is that most people start searching for something on the local context, don't find a lot of papers and quickly conclude there's nothing written on the subject. I could be looking for something on urban renewal in Johannesburg. I'll probably find about 3 or 4 papers. That doesn't mean there are only 3 or 4 papers written on urban renewal around the world. It only means there are only 3 or 4 on Johannesburg. Yes? Okay. Now you can have, if you do urban renewal, you probably might find 4. The same concept is called urban regeneration. And if you use urban regeneration instead of urban renewal, you might find a further 6. If you then go and look for urban transformation, you might find a further 10. And before you know it, you find about 20, 25 articles on the subject. In other words, it helps to find synonyms to the concepts you're trying to explore. Right? So that nobody come out and say, oh, you know what, I looked at this and nothing has been written on the subject. There's just 2 written in South Africa, which means that there's just 2 papers ever written on the subject. That is almost invariably unlikely to happen. And even in cases where nothing has been written on the subject in South Africa, there are lots of countries in the world with similar socioeconomic profiles as this country. So you can always find something on Brazil, Colombia, probably Malaysia, Singapore, or depending on the topic, you can even find that, yeah, there's something written on Australia. It looks very much like the legal system here. So there is always something written on a subject somewhere. So you simply need to expand the search. And then once you find what you need, modify the search, you find more. Now, one of the things we encountered just when I got to VITS was that students went to RIA and our other colleague and complained about how it was expensive to find research articles because they had to buy them. What they forgot was that VITS had already paid for these things, so all they needed to do was to log on to the VITS library website and take them for free. So is there anybody else here who is already buying articles from your own pocket? I hope not, because TUT has already paid for it. So you need to know how the library works so you can get it for free. Then you can send me the money.
Can I just say something
Sure.
at this point?
Yes.
So for those of you that aren't registered, you won't have access to the library by yourself.
Okay.
So what you do is you go into Google Scholar, you find the articles with the proper references, you send that through to your supervisor will send it to the library and the library will find the articles for you.
Okay.
Okay. For
Good.
those of you that are registered or are personnel, you already have access.
Right.
And the session on the 2nd and 3rd of April that we've scheduled is to teach you how to
Access
use
these.
those databases.
Okay. Oh, so there's more good stuff on the way. Nice. All right. So you'll be taken through how to find some of these databases. You get to know the best databases for your subject. So I'm going to skip this. Now, what you typically find is that if you have access, you can actually see the full article that you can save electronically. Now, if you have access to internet on a campus already, one of the advantages for you is that if you're looking for something in Google Scholar through the TUT system, if TUT has paid for it, it will already show as a PDF. Now, the essential point about this is that if you have to do good research, you need to collect an initially substantial amount of information to be able to arrive at the most relevant. So supposing you need about 2 pages of references, you probably need to collect about twice as much to be able to get your good references that span 2 pages. So if you need 20 good references, you're probably going to need to collect about 40 articles to get 20 good references. Yes? Now I'm saying this because you need to have a realistic idea of how much workload is required to do these things. Now, once you get those materials, you need to evaluate them. There is the initial appraisal, but also there is the analysis of the content itself. So we deal with both. Now, the quality of the review you do depends on finding quality literature to begin with. Now, the analysis of this may center the accuracy of the information, the reliability or potential bias of the sources, and the value of the source in relation to the argument or the case you want to make. Now, you may get these things either from primary sources, which is where these things originally appeared, or you may get it from secondary sources, which basically just reuse where these things originally appeared. Now, peer-reviewed articles are typically primary sources because that's where these things officially come out the first time. Textbooks, on the other hand, are secondary sources. Why? Because textbooks will typically synthesize peer-reviewed work that has been done going back decades. Now, the recycling is what makes it secondary, right? Now, the other thing about secondary sources is that the alteration sometimes introduces error into what people have done. Or some writers use primary sources and only keep or use those parts that support the argument and leave the parts that don't support the argument. Which is why sometimes one of the things that I do is that when I read a paper, I go back and look at their reference list and try to read some of their reference just to be sure they use the whole argument. Okay? All right. One way to initially evaluate an article is to look at who the author is. Is he an authority in the area? If he's an authority in the area, you're likely to find a lot of other things written on the area by the same person. That increases the credibility of what you're reading. So for example, one of the articles that we're going to use today, you can just Google the author and see how many other articles has written on the subject you're reading on. And you can also Google him and actually find out where he works. And that tells you something about whether he's credible as a source or he's not. Typically, years of academic research and activity in the particular research area increases credibility on the subject. Now, if no author is shown, almost invariably it means that no one is willing to take responsibility for the source. Now, I would hesitate to use a source for which there is no author. Because human beings love to take credit for what they do, right? So why would somebody not want to put a name to what he's publishing? So if the thing doesn't have an author, I would hesitate to use it. Yeah? And then you might want to look at the date of publication. As I said, to be at the cutting edge of the discussion, you need to find the most recent. Now, that is not to say old articles are useless. The area I research in, the best literature review to date, has been published in 2008. So for the students that I supervise, I ask them, read that one first before you read everything else, because it introduces you to the area rather nicely. So some old articles are still good, but you want to make sure that you start off by reading the latest on the discussion. You can also find out how many other authors, how many other people have published and cited this author. Because if you did good work, a lot of people quote what you do. One of the biggest ironies about, I graduated from the university a little over, about 2 years ago. So I haven't done a lot of work on any subject at all. But the biggest irony is that my most cited paper is actually a working paper I never even bothered to publish. It was a working paper. It astonishes the hell out of me. I hated the subject, I was forced to do it, and I did it. And then I left it there. It's actually my most cited paper. I still don't understand what people are doing citing that paper. But you need to see that if the work is good, a lot of people cite it. And you also want to scrutinize the language a bit. Now, you notice there's a difference, as she said, between reading a newspaper or a novel and reading a research article. Research articles need to be written in, let's say, emotionally neutral language, because we try to approach objectivity as best as possible. Now, let me give you a rather graphic example of what I mean by emotional neutral language and emotion leading language. Now, if you don't change your mind easily, we can describe you as firm. Now, if we want to make it sound a bit negative, then we could describe you as obstinate, right? And if we really, really want to slime you, we'll call you pig-headed. Now, they're all describing the same phenomenon, except firm is positive. But when we describe you as pig-headed, we're not complimenting you, right? Now, what you do when you read is that when you find the author using emotionally laden language, then you want to be careful, because they're probably trying to nudge you in a particular direction. So you need to analyze the language for objectivity. Now, why do you have to take notes rather than highlight? As I said before, when you highlight, you remember very little. Now, that's proven now, so we don't have to debate that one. But the thing about taking notes is that when you take notes, you read it more carefully. It's just that simple. When you take notes, you read a lot more carefully. How many people read novels on a regular basis? How many people remember what's written in every page of the novels? Yeah, because you're not reading it so you can remember, right? You're just reading it for fun. If you're like Bill Crystal, then you probably start a novel, and then you're going to read the end because you're afraid you might die before the novel ends, so you want to know how the story ended. Right? okay? But you're reading it for fun. But when you read research articles, you want to know what's in there. So it helps to make notes because you read it more carefully. Now, for the purposes of this assignment, they'll probably ask you to turn over your notes so they can see what you've been doing. But if you're doing normal research, those notes are for yourself. Now, one of the ways to protect yourself from having to struggle to find out where you read that interesting bit of information is try to append to your notes the full bibliographic information. The name of the author, the title of the article, the title of the journal, the date of publication, because that allows you then to know exactly where you read that juicy bit of information. So it's not that complicated to protect yourself from that problem. Have you realized? You just need to be a bit more meticulous. It also helps to save the articles because sometimes once you go a little bit along in the research, you probably forget details of what you've read. So sometimes I like to go back and reread. Now, we will start by teaching you how to write formal notes. But as you get into the hang of it, for those of you who probably might come back and do a PhD or something, it will get less informal, but by then you would have internalized the way these things are supposed to be done. The reason the approach is going to make you write very formal notes using specific rubrics is because that's how you get into the habit of knowing where to look and what to take out of those articles. In the beginning, I promise you, it's slow, it's painful, but that's how we all got started. Once you master it, it's not as painful. So, like bullying, it's going to get better, okay? Note-taking also helps you make sense of published research. Because if you're an experienced researcher, you know the conventions. If you're not an experienced researcher, you don't know where the jewels are buried. So note-taking, especially in the formal sense in which they're going to make you do it, is our way of getting you to make sense of published research. It helps you understand the format of what you're reading. It also helps you evaluate arguments critically. And sometimes the headings will serve as questions that make you read critically, because not all of us are naturally critical. Some people are naturally critical, some people are not, right? Somebody might sit in church on Sunday and say, Peter came saying, oh, we cured this guy who was born blind. And Thomas would go, how do you know he was born blind? Were you there? Now, some people are naturally critical. But some people take everything as face value. Right? Okay. So in research, it helps to be critical. So we would create formats and templates to make you critical if you're not a naturally critical person. Now, understanding format. Research papers actually, after a while, you realize follow a common pattern. There's a pattern to them. This pattern actually just illustrates the way science is done. Now, a lot of what you read, you notice, falls into three categories. Remember the paper I said you should read first if you're trying to know about an area? The literature review, the review paper. The review papers basically survey the work that others have done, right? Which is why I said if you're new to an area, try to read a review paper because it gives you an idea of what everybody else has done on the subject, at least up to a point. There are some other papers that are purely theoretical studies, and they do complex mathematical formulae, and you read it and you feel dizzy, and you wonder why you bothered to go to school. Like, look, I could have stayed on the farm and life would have been easier. You know, I grew up in a small West African village, and sometimes I felt I should have just stayed there. Life was simpler, right? Okay. the purely theoretical studies. And then sometimes worse or just only slightly better than the purely theoretical studies are studies in which people have actually gone to collect data, analyzed it, and they do all these complex statistics, and you're wondering what those numbers mean, right? Who struggles with those statistics? You know, I was helping my student to analyze his data yesterday, and I realized since I haven't used SPSS in the last 2 years, I no longer even remember what the commands are. So I'm going to spend tonight trying to figure out how that thing works because I forgot. So imagine you. There's nothing wrong with you, okay? There's nothing wrong with you. It's just hard. But as I tell you, you know, it comes with practice. Once you practice after a few times, you get back into it. It was only when I would walk into the car in the evening, deep in the night, that I remembered, oh yes, I remember how that works. But it took me about 2.5 hours. All right, so let's start. We're going to start with the exercise here. You all got this back. It's almost the top of the hour. Should we take a break first? 5 minutes. Anybody want to you know, go do the thing and come back? And then once you come back, you can fasten your seatbelt because this plane is about to take off.